We're holding this interview on the heels of the most recent 11-day conflict.
It can light a tinderbox of anti-Semitism all around the world. We are the guinea pigs of this failed experiment of the nuclear deal.
Welcome to Global Perspectives. I'm Ellie Cohanim, and every week I will be bringing you the most important conversations in the Jewish world. We launch Global Perspectives with my interview of Ambassador Ron Dermer. Ron Dermer was Israel's ambassador to the United States from 2013 to 2021, serving in that role under two sharply different administrations, namely Barack Obama and Donald Trump. Ambassador Dermer's tenure spanned some of the Jewish people and Israel's most significant events in recent history, including the Obama administration's 2015 JCPOA Iran deal, the landmark $38 billion military aid package signed in 2016 between the U.S. and Israel, the move of the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the U.S. recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, and the signing of the Abraham Accords. Join me now. Ambassador Ron Dermer, thank you for joining Global Perspectives with Ellie Cohanim. It's an honor to have you with us.
Great to be with you, Ellie.
We're holding this interview on the heels of the most recent 11-day conflict between Hamas and the Jewish state of Israel, which Israel termed the Operation Guardian of the Walls. What I observed starting with the events at Sheikh Jarrah and through the end of the Hamas rocket attacks on Israel were, one, a surprising and I'm sure welcome support from Europe and the Biden administration for Israel to defend herself and her population centers, and two, an international media that often seemed dishonest and biased in their coverage of the conflict. Ron, what is your take on the international media's coverage? What do you think they got wrong?
Well, it was pretty bad, and Ellie, they just played right into the hands of Hamas, because the strategy of Hamas is to essentially not only target our civilians, but embed their own civilians and essentially turn them into human shields. And so they place rocket launchers and various different armaments next to schools, mosques, hospitals, in private homes, because when we respond to the launching of rockets against us and we try to surgically strike at those, rocketeers, then invariably, even if we use tremendous restraint, which we did, you're going to see civilians who are going to be unfortunately and tragically killed. Hamas is doing that on purpose. They are actually putting their civilians in harm's way. And what they rely on is either a gullible international media or a malicious international media to then blame Israel for the civilian casualties. And if they can blame Israel for the civilian casualties, that's how they think pressure will be brought to bear on Israel to stop its military operations. And then they can declare, quote unquote, victory. Because here you have a terror organization confronting Israel. Israel responds, and instead of the world fully backing, it's not just enough, Ellie. I know people back Israel's right to defend itself. I mean, the fact that this is something that we should be proud of is really absurd, because Israel's fighting a terror organization. I would hope that, Israel, and I think it does, anytime we have another country, another democracy, it's fighting against terror organizations, you're not going to hear a word of criticism from Israel's government towards any of those governments. But when it comes to Israel, and when Israel's fighting terrorism, then you have all these governments that start to parse words. They use language of moral equivalence, both sides, cycle of violence, all of this nonsense that they do time after time. And, that's bad enough. And then you have the international media on top of it, essentially blaming Israel for what is a double war crime of Hamas, both targeting our civilians and also using their own civilians as human shields. And the media, went for it. I unfortunately, Ellie, I think it's not gullibility. I think it's more malicious. I think it's an attempt to cast Israel as the evil actor in this equation, as a force for evil. And now let's just prove it. Let's figure out how we can show that Israel is a bad actor. And I think it's dangerous. It's dangerous for democracies, and it's certainly dangerous because it can light a tinderbox of anti-Semitism all around the world with this demonization of Israel that has been going on for many years, and I think reached a new crescendo in the latest round in Gaza.
Well, Ron, I'm really glad that you brought that up. And so I want to ask you two questions on that before we get on to the anti-Semitism we saw rising all around the world. First, I also would like to speak a little bit about the role of Iran in this conflict. So just 2 days ago, we saw an op-ed in Newsweek published by Dr. Ali al-Nuaimi, who serves in the United Arab Emirates Federal National Council, and I had the honor of meeting with him when I was in office. And the title of it was, "It's Time to Free the Palestinians from Hamas and Iran." And in the op-ed, Dr. Nuaimi states, quote, "The Middle East conflict isn't between the Israelis and Palestinians, but between Israel and Iran." What exactly was Iran's role in this conflict?
Well, Iran, there's two terror organizations in Gaza, main terror organizations. There is Hamas and there's Islamic Jihad. Islamic Jihad being the junior partner in terrorism. Islamic Jihad is a wholly owned subsidiary of the government of Iran. I mean, it's fully financed. All its weapons come from Iran. Iran owns that organization and will instruct it whether to attack or whether not to attack. Hamas is also supported overwhelmingly by Iran. In fact, Hamas leaders boasted just recently of the fact that Hamas is giving them, that Iran is giving them these weapons, that is financing them, that had sent experts in order to teach them how to do it. What used to happen, Ellie, is that Iran would send weapons and missiles, in particular, to Gaza. And they would send it through Sudan, and it would go up through Egypt, through the Sinai, and into Gaza. And when Israel interdicted a lot of those routes and shut a lot of that down, it became much more difficult, particularly when we got in President Sisi, a partner in Egypt that was working to stop those smuggling routes. Hamas then shifted to a strategy, which is, if you give a terrorist a rocket, they'll fire one. But if you teach them how to make rockets, they can fire thousands. And that's exactly what Iran did, and sent experts into Gaza, or a lot of times got Hamas officials to come to Tehran, explain to them and really taught them how to make these arms, how to build those missiles. And so you have those missile manufacturing capabilities in Gaza now that Hamas is using, and it's really all because of the expertise that they got from Iran. In addition to the money that they get from Iran, it's the expertise and the training and the political support that they get. So Iran is certainly a major actor, and the person from the Emirates who you quoted is completely right. I mean, Hamas and the Palestinians are a small story compared to the big story in the Middle East, which is this battle not just between Israel and Iran. It's between Iran and Israel and our Arab partners and many other players in the region, because everywhere you look in the Middle East, if there's a problem, 9 times out of 10, Iran is behind it.
Ron, I actually wrote an op-ed about that myself, and I thought the timing of this conflict was not coincidental. What are your thoughts on the timing in terms of, in my argument, it was the Biden administration engaging with Iran in the Vienna talks that kind of bolstered and empowered the Iranians and their proxy Hamas to take these aggressive actions against Israel. Do you think that's an accurate assessment?
I think the timing may have been driven by actually a fight within Palestinian politics between Hamas and Fatah, and Hamas essentially trying to overtake and dominate the Palestinian Authority. Abu Mazen, for a brief period of time, had agreed to an election. And then he pulled back from that election, knowing full well that he was going to be defeated. I think he's in the 16th or 17th year of his 4-year term right now. He didn't want to go to an election to see Hamas take over. That's what they did the last time he went to an election 15 years ago, when they actually won the vote. So he didn't want to see that happen again. He pulled back. And Hamas, I think, tried to stir the pot. They did it in this neighborhood in Jerusalem, the Sheikh Jarrah, which is Shimon HaTzadik is the original name. Nobody knows the facts about this issue. But they used that with a gullible or malicious international media fomenting against Israel. Then they used the Al-Aqsa Mosque lie, which is always their go-to, that Israel is going to somehow destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And then they fired several rockets into Jerusalem on Jerusalem Day. And my sense, and this is something you have to ask the people who saw the actual intelligence, my sense is that they thought Israel would respond, but moderately, and not respond overwhelmingly as Israel did. And they thought maybe they'd come out of this with a political victory. And so instead, what happened is we hit them very, very hard. We degraded a lot of their capabilities. We took out about 200 fighters. We also took away this subterranean tunnel network that they have, which is used to move weapons and fighters from one place to another, which was very important in their war strategy. We knocked out a good chunk of that. The actual percentage, I think, they don't know yet, and we don't even know yet. But I think that they were sort of surprised by it. But there is no question, if you think about Iran's role here, that Iran had nothing to lose and everything to gain from this conflict. To see Hamas fight Israel, I mean, it's good for the Iranians. Whether the general sense of weakness that is being projected today because of a rush to go back into the nuclear deal, which makes no sense whatsoever, whether that had any role in Iran's decision-making or Hamas's decision-making, I don't know. I still think that what happened in Gaza is essentially a sideshow to the larger issue of whether the United States is going to go back into the nuclear deal and make a terrible, terrible mistake, which could have catastrophic consequences for Israel's national security and for the national security of our Arab partners in the region.
Yeah, exactly right, Ron. And I think that what we've seen not only from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and we need to talk about that, but also from leaders in the Arab world, in the Sunni Gulf countries, is they have kind of warned the United States over and again that if the U.S. does proceed to engage Iran in the Vienna talks and possibly go right back into the 2015 Iran deal, the JCPOA, that it would lead to a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. And on the Israeli side, we've heard the Prime Minister Netanyahu say that Israel will not allow Iran to become a nuclear weapons state. Do you think that that's accurate and that the U.S. is taking into consideration both the Israeli and the Arab concerns with the talks?
No, I don't think they're taking it into consideration. Look at what happened with Iran. In the case of Iran, Israel and the Arab world were 100% against doing this deal. We said publicly what the Arab world said privately. You probably heard it from Arab leaders at the time. Everybody knew exactly where the Arabs stood. They didn't want to say publicly what they were saying privately. Prime Minister Netanyahu said publicly exactly what we were saying privately. And the United States ignored our concerns. And the United States raced into a deal which does not prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. The idea that, this was said constantly in 2015, this deal blocks Iran's path to the bomb. And it was just not true. It was false then and it's false now. If it were true, the Prime Minister of Israel would have been the first world leader to embrace the deal. I would have gone house to house in the United States to convince people to support a deal because it would have removed the existential threat, the one threat to the survival of the state of Israel. But it doesn't do that. It just puts restrictions for a brief period of time, and then those restrictions are automatically removed. And at that point, Iran doesn't need to break in or sneak into the nuclear club. It just simply walks into the nuclear club. So it legitimizes Iran's military nuclear program. And in addition to that, by removing all the sanctions, it paves Iran's path to a nuclear arsenal with gold, because they're getting hundreds of billions of dollars that are going into their coffers, which allows them to continue their campaign of aggression and terrorism throughout the region. And they're destabilizing states throughout the region, in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Yemen and Gaza, all these areas where you have proxies of Iran that are destabilizing and fomenting violence and insecurity throughout the region. So here you have a situation now, that was in 2015 when the deal was done. Now, Trump left the deal, thankfully, which I think the most important decision a president of the United States has ever made for the national security of Israel, by veering away from a glide path to nuclear weapons and by also starving that regime of hundreds of billions of dollars. And ultimately, he also took out the driver of this war machine in taking out Qasem Soleimani. But now you have a Biden administration, when it has all the leverage in the world and all the power that those sanctions have created, and they're basically, the appeasement of the Biden administration to the Iranians is breathtaking. And it is against the position of Israel, and it is against the position of the Arab states. And what is their argument? We are joining our allies. Which allies? Britain, France, Germany? They live thousands of miles away. Imagine that we'd have some confrontation in Europe, and the United States would ignore Britain, France, and Germany. Ignore what they have to say and rely on what Israel and the Arab states said. We live in the region. We are, just to finish the point, we live in the region. We are the guinea pigs of this failed experiment of the nuclear deal. And because they're locked into an ideology or a political position, they are gambling with the security of hundreds of millions of people in the region. And what you heard said about it launching a nuclear arms race, totally true. And the prime minister said it in his speech to Congress in 2015. He said, it's not a farewell to arms, it's a farewell to arms control. Because the second the Arab states believe that Iran is actually going to get nuclear weapons, you're going to see the Saudis, you're going to see other actors in the region, the Turks, the Egyptians, and others, they're going to want to have nuclear weapons on their own. And then you're going to turn one of the most dangerous areas of the world into a nuclear tinderbox. There is no reason whatsoever why the United States should be going back into the deal. It is a breathtaking act of appeasement, and I hope that President Biden will not make this terrible, terrible mistake.
Well, Ron, I'll tell you in my conversations, not in office, but since leaving office with some people in the Arab world, what's amazing to me is that it looks like the Arab world is actually relying on little Israel to take on Iran. And I think that's also just an incredible development. If you look at Israel, a country that was just founded in 1948, and now this small Jewish state has become the protector of the entire region against an aggressive Iran. It's really something to behold.
You're absolutely right. And one thing that the speech to Congress did when the Prime Minister of Israel stood up and opposed that deal, it greatly accelerated our relations underneath the surface with those Arab states because they realized that Israel was willing to take a stand. And that was very important in ultimately, I think, creating the Abraham Accords, which came out several years later, because they realized that we could be a dependable ally in the region, particularly at a time when the United States is withdrawing its military forces from the region, is reducing its military footprint. And I know American politicians don't agree on a lot, but one thing that Obama, Trump, and Biden all agreed on is no one wanted to send troops to the Middle East. And so those Arab states who see the threats of Iran, who see the threats of radical Sunni Islam, it could be Al-Qaeda, ISIS, or whatever comes next, and they see that the United States, the 800-pound gorilla, is leaving the building. Then they look at Israel and they see, well, here's a 250-pound gorilla with a kippah on. Maybe we should work with them and to protect us. So, but you have to separate what they say publicly by how they act privately, because underneath the surface, I believe actually this appeasement policy is going to bring them closer, even closer to Israel out of concern for their basic security. But I think the space for Arab leaders to stand publicly with Israel will actually shrink.
Yeah, Ron, you know what? I couldn't agree with you more. And I know for me, one of the most glorious days as part of the Trump administration was that September day on the White House lawn where we saw the signing of the Abraham Accords. And I want to ask you a little bit about your own experience as ambassador of Israel to the United States at the time. Was your role in helping Israel achieve this warm peace between the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and then afterwards Sudan and Morocco? Is that your proudest achievement in office? Tell us a little bit what you do feel are your proudest achievements. And also I want to ask you a two-part question. You, I think, filled this incredibly unique role and had this unique experience of serving under wildly different American presidents, Barack Obama and Donald Trump. So I'd love to also hear your thoughts on the contrast of working with the United States under those two very different administrations.
Well, as to the first question, my proudest moment was actually when the president gave his speech. When the prime minister came to give his speech to Congress. And the reason I say that it surprised some people, because I think in doing so, he gave meaning to Jewish sovereignty. Because what does it mean to have a sovereign state? So it means that we have the military power to defend ourselves. It means that we have a refuge for Jews fleeing persecution around the world. Those two things I think people understand. And that's a great change in the condition of the Jewish people with the birth of Israel, where we had a refuge and a shield. But Israel also has a voice. And we have to use that voice when you're facing a threat to the very survival of the country. And people who are lost in a world of politics and frankly non-important issues could never quite understand that. We're only 75 years after the Holocaust. We've got a regime in Iran that is openly calling and actively working to destroy the one and only Jewish state, that's tweeting about the end of Israel. And to have a prime minister of Israel, to have that voice come and to come to Congress and to speak up publicly when in 75 years ago we were silent when facing, because we had no power. We had no sovereign state to make the case. Here, the prime minister of the Jewish state stands, speaks. Now, ultimately, American leaders are going to make their decision. But Israel had to speak out at that critical moment. And in doing so, like I said, it gave meaning to Jewish sovereignty and was certainly my proudest moment as ambassador, because the other things, which I'm proud of a lot of things, and I'm proud of a lot of things that were with both administrations, we were able, to work out a $38 billion 10-year MOU for military assistance with the Obama administration, despite the serious differences we had on policy. I'm quite proud of that. I'm proud that we were able to replenish Iron Dome assistance after the last round in 2014. I was proud when we could host President Obama to speak and to award an American who had saved actually 200 lives during World War II to award him with one of Israel's greatest honors, a righteous among the nations. And with President Trump, it's a very, very long list, from recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital to recognizing Israeli sovereignty on the Golan Heights to changing the legal definition of Judea and Samaria and how the United States looks at, to the advance of the peace plan that was put down, which is the first plan that actually seriously takes into account Israel's security concerns and recognizes our rights in the land of Israel, and then ultimately to the Abraham Accords. But the difference with those is it relied on others. It relied on the United States making decisions. It relied on our Arab peace partners making decisions. The issue with the speech was a decision that the prime minister himself had to make. And I think if you're not willing to speak out for your country at such a critical moment when it comes to a matter of national survival, you don't deserve to be in that chair and entrusted with the awesome responsibility of protecting the one and only Jewish state. So that's the one that I'm proudest of. As for, again, with Obama and President Trump, obviously two very, very different administrations. I served 3.5 years with at the time of the Obama administration and 4 years, the full 4 years with the Trump administration. So you could see a difference. There's no question about that on the major, particularly on the major issues, because with the Obama administration, as soon as I arrived, within a couple of weeks of my arrival, they had made the interim agreement with Iran. This was in the end of 2013, in October 2013, which ultimately led into the deal they did in the summer of 2015. But they had already made an interim agreement with Iran. So right from the get-go, we were sort of in this clash over what is a major foreign policy, if not the single most important foreign policy of the Obama administration, and is a matter of life and death for the state of Israel. So that made it, I think, challenging. And I think we disagreed on the way to advance peace. I think that the Obama administration was locked into this paradigm that had not delivered peace for over 20 years, or over 20 years at that point. And I think they kept doing the same thing over and over again, hoping to achieve a different result, which, somebody once said, is a definition of insanity. And we were opposed to it. But despite that opposition, I think what we were able to accomplish with the Obama administration actually shows the strength of the alliance between the United States and Israel. Because when you disagree on such fundamental issues, to be able to do a 10-year MOU, to be able to deepen your intelligence sharing, to be able to build other pillars of the relationship and strengthen the relationship between the United States and Israel, it was not a small thing. And we worked every day to do that despite those differences. With the Trump administration, you really we saw eye to eye on the threat of Iran, and that affected regional policies. And we also ultimately found a common position when it came to what was the best way to advance peace. And fortunately, because we had that common position, because the United States, I should say, took this confrontational policy with Iran, because they refused to let, under President Trump, the Palestinians have a veto on the peace process and on advancing peace with the Arab world, and frankly, because of their embrace of Israel. Remember, as I said, Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, Judea and Samaria, all of these issues happened under President Trump. And you remember a lot of people at the time said this is going to kill any prospects of peace. Well, we didn't achieve peace with the Palestinians, but we hadn't done that for 100 years. But it didn't block our ability in any way diminish our ability to make peace with our Arab neighbors who were ready and I think strategically understood that their interests were tied and their interests would be advanced, I should say, for making peace with Israel. And it didn't stop them. If anything, I think it accelerated it, because the message that those decisions that the Trump administration made regarding Israel sent a message to those Arab states that, you know, one way that you can get a better relationship with Washington, get a better relationship with Jerusalem. So we knocked out the idea that the road to peace goes through Ramallah, and we actually advanced an idea that a road to better relations with Washington can also go through Jerusalem. And I think that was, a big achievement, and I'm proud of that.
Oh, there is so much to be proud of, Ron. And so I think it's a great segue for me to ask, as you know, the world Jewish community, I think, really watched you in office and so much appreciated your leadership. And also the number of times that you took to the airwaves in defense of Israel. So I think a lot of us are wondering what's next for Ambassador Ron Dermer.
You know what? I don't know. I haven't decided. I came back 3 months ago after 7.5 years in Washington and also 4 years in the Prime Minister's office, which makes the time in Washington look like a picnic, because I don't think there's anybody who works harder. And I can't say that I worked harder than my boss, I have to say. It's sort of round the clock. But I haven't made any decisions. I hope to be able to contribute as I have I've been blessed to and privileged to over the last 12 years, to continue to help secure the Jewish future and defend the state of Israel. And I think a lot of work needs to be done. And I think we have a lot of challenges. And one of the most important challenges is to just let people understand the threats that we're facing. Let people understand the reality, because we could have differences, Ellie, of the best way to navigate a reality. We could have big differences over it because, you know, we all have our own approach to how to cross a certain terrain. But we have to know if the terrain in front of us is a desert or an ocean. Because if you bring a ship to the desert, you ain't getting very far. And if you bring a camel to cross an ocean, you're going to sink right down to the bottom. And what I see happening on many issues today is that whether it comes to the relationship between the United States and Israel, or the relationship between Israel and diaspora Jews, to the best way to advance peace, or to the dangers of Iran, I think a lot of people don't necessarily see the terrain in front of them and accurately understand what the challenges are and what the opportunities are. How to navigate it is actually a secondary question to me, because I think a lot of people are focused on navigating and didn't ask themselves the simple question, is that a desert or an ocean? And I hope to be able to do something in that regard in definitely in the months ahead, and we'll see where that takes me.
Well, Ron, I have to tell you that with this most recent Gaza conflict, we saw Representative Rashida Tlaib, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and other members of the squad call Israel an apartheid state. We saw Representative Ilhan Omar tweet that Israel's self-defense actions were, quote, an act of terrorism. And so many people feel that while Israel during this Gaza conflict was fighting a military fight on the home front, Israel was also under a PR war internationally. And I think that for many people in the United States and overseas who see Israel, feel that Israel often loses the PR war. And so this will be my final question. What do you think Israel can do to try to do better on the PR front?
First of all, Ellie, Jews have been losing the PR war for 2,500 years. And the demonization of the Jews is a very, very old problem. And many people believe that if we just educate people about the facts, that that's going to end that. The Jew hatred will end because we'll just give them the facts. I don't believe that. I still think we have to do that effort of education as much as we can, but I know something about the history of anti-Semitism. And to a certain extent, Ellie, the Holocaust has distorted our view of anti-Semitism because it's such a blinding event that it sort of blocks out 25 centuries of anti-Semitism that happened before. This is a very, very old and lethal problem. And, you know, take any century going back 25 centuries. I ask your listeners, you know, pick a century and look at the attacks against Jews in that century. And it'll shock people. We've been expelled from countries throughout Europe and in other places around the world. We've had pogroms, we've had massacres, we've had all of this. And this is a very, very old problem. And people after the Holocaust thought that in this sort of half century after the Holocaust, when it was politically incorrect in Western polite society to go after Jews, but you didn't really have it in Western society anywhere near the extent that you have it today. And people thought that those decades after the Holocaust were a new normal, but it wasn't. It was just the exception to the rule. And what we have in the demonization of Israel, we have a return to the norm of anti-Semitism. So when you have people accusing Israel of apartheid or genocide or ethnic cleansing or war crimes, what you have are these very, very old libels against the Jewish people. And those people who would make these charges, what has to be done, they have to not get immunity from the anti-Semitism that's going to follow it. Because the physical attacks, and you know this as well as anybody, the physical attacks on the Jews follow the defamation of the Jewish people. So when you lie and you call Israel an apartheid state, and you lie and you say Israel's engaged in genocide, and you lie and you say Israel's guilty of a war crime, and you have people who are at the commanding heights of the culture, a guy like Trevor Noah or John Oliver, who say these shameful things, they are taking a match and throwing it into a powder keg that is 2,500 years old. So this problem with the PR, we'll fight the fight. We'll make our case. We'll educate those people of goodwill and open minds and to try to convince them of the facts. We'll also educate our own people. Most important than anything else is to not lose our own sense of the justice of our cause, to give your own people the facts, to keep making the case, because they're living in a world of so many lies. But we shouldn't kid ourselves. This is a very old problem. And the good news, Ellie, is that the difference now from the 25 centuries that preceded the Holocaust, the difference now is that the Jewish people have a state. The Jewish people have sovereign power. As I said, we have a shield, we have a refuge, and we have a voice, and we're going to use it. And as I like to remind people all the time, I was 7.5 years as ambassador of Israel in Washington, and I had meetings with almost everybody, scores of ambassadors. I never saw the ambassador of Babylon. I never saw the ambassador of Imperial Rome. And I never saw the ambassador of the 1,000-year Reich. Okay? But there is an ambassador of Israel, and there continue to be ambassadors of Israel defending us against these slanders. And fortunately, we have sovereign power, and we have to use that power. And also, Jews have to begin to fight back against their own demonization. And if we don't stand up for ourselves, we learn from history, no one's going to stand up for us. But I think that the tide is turning, and I hope that we're going to stand very strong and push back against these forces and hopefully win the day.
Ambassador Ron Dermer, I have to say that I think you, in your persona, you are the personification of Jewish sovereignty, American-born. You made Aliyah, and you've served your country, Israel, at the highest levels. I think that the Jewish people are grateful to you for your service, and I think it's fascinating for me to know that your proudest achievement was the moment that you think Israel showed its sovereignty to the world, with the Prime Minister of Israel coming to the United States to speak against the Iran deal in Congress. This was a fascinating conversation. I can't thank you enough for joining us, and we hope to have you back again. Ambassador Ron Dermer, thank you.
Thank you.
I found Ron Dermer's thoughts on Jewish sovereignty fascinating. I hope you did too. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you'll join me next time for Global Perspectives.